Hey, this is Jeff, Senior Pastor of Grace Church in Longmont, and I'm going to be recording a podcast teaching through the book of Romans. I have a friend who's a podcaster, and he's been trying to get me in the game, as he calls it, for a while, and I've just not really had the time or the wherewithal to figure out what would I teach and how would I do it. But in this time of quarantining and social distancing, I actually have time, and I have a microphone. So we're going to try this. What we're going to do is go through the book of Romans verse by verse to try to understand it a little better. And one way to figure out how we're going to do that and how intensely we're going to do that is to think in terms of scuba diving versus snorkeling. My family and I had a chance to go and do some snorkeling on a family vacation recently. And my daughter, Rachel, and I, we got out in the ocean and got to snorkel to see manta rays, which was amazing. The way we did this is there were some guys who were scubaing, and they went down to the floor of the ocean and set up this light, this big, bright floodlight that attracts the type of fish that the mantas feed on. And so there's no guarantee whether or not we'd see a ray, but we were up on the surface of the water snorkeling and looking down, and we saw the hard work they were doing. Some of the scuba guys had cameras down there. They said they would send us footage of what they saw, but I never got that. So we're up there looking down, and eventually it's dark outside, it's cold in the water, but we're looking down, and these manta rays started coming, and we had like 5 that showed up that night. And when they passed in front of the floodlight, it looked like the bat signal. It was so cool. These things come kind of, it's like they're flying underwater, and then they'd go across the light, and we'd see this huge shadow, and everybody was giving a thumbs up, and it was really great. What we saw was not the same thing the scuba divers saw, because they were down there at the bottom. I mean, they probably could have reached out and touched these things. We couldn't. They never came up as high as where we were, but we still got to see them. So when we're studying anything, in particular a book of the Bible, we need to know, are we going to get down to the bottom of all this and put on our scuba gear and get down there and study every tiny little thing? Or are we going to be more at the snorkel level where we can still see it, we're still in the water, but we're not going to parse every single verb, and we're not going to tear apart every little perspective or way to look at this? No, this is going to be a situation for us going through Romans where we're going to be snorkeling, not scuba diving. And there's also going to be people like, the rest of my family that decided not to snorkel. They weren't into that kind of thing. And so they spent their evening sitting at home in the nice resort where we were staying. If you want to stay in the resort, I guess this podcast isn't for you, because we're getting out and we're going to be looking at cool stuff. And that's kind of what my hope is that we put on the snorkel gear and we look at the book of Romans together. Why Romans? Well, Romans is one of those books in the New Testament that if I could preach it on a Sunday, I would, because it's so dense and powerful and important in the Christian faith, and maybe someday I will. The problem is, to do Romans right, you need a lot of time. It is dense. There is so much in here, even at the snorkel level. If I were to do this on a Sunday in preaching sermons, it would be more like we're looking under the water from the perspective of one of those seaplanes that lands on the water from like Raiders of the Lost Ark. So instead, we're going to snorkel and we're going to take our time, but we're still not going to get as crazy deep as you can. In fact, if you want to get really, really deep on the book of Romans, there's so much out there you can look at. There's commentaries that are, 1.5 feet thick, because there's so much in there. It is the most brilliant piece of literature as it pertains especially to salvation and Christ that's ever been written, the book of Romans. It is a highly respected philosophical document. It is, for people like me who believe it's inspired by God, it is scripture and it is life transforming. But at the end of the day, what you can't say is that Romans is simple. And so there's no way to do this in a way that would make it simple. My hope, though, is as we read through this and study this, we get to the point where we have a better understanding and can understand in a way this complexity in a way that does make sense to us. I had a good friend when I was coming out of college and just starting a ministry. He became a Christian when he was in college because he had gone to like an InterVarsity rally or something like that, and somebody had given him a Bible. He went back to his dorm and started thumbing through the table of contents and came to Romans. He didn't know where to start. He didn't know anything about the Bible. And so he decided, I'm going to start in Romans because I'll bet there's great stories in there about gladiators. If you are familiar with the book of Romans at all, it has nothing to do with gladiators. Even though it was written in 56, 57 AD, right as Nero was coming to power, it doesn't mention Nero at all. It doesn't mention any Caesars at all. Ultimately, it doesn't really have anything to say about the Roman Empire except for the fact that what God did in human history happened when the Romans were in charge. Nonetheless, that read-through of the Bible led this guy to Christ. He became a Christian because he read the book of Romans. It was so clear to him and so logical as he read through it. And hopefully, as we read through it, we'll be transformed spiritually in some ways as well. And if you want to wear a toga while you listen to this, just, for history's sake, go right ahead. I won't judge. I'm not in charge of what you wear while you listen to podcasts, but I'm going to be recording this fully clothed. You have my word on that. Now, as we go through Romans, we need to know some of the background on it. Romans was written by the Apostle Paul, as I said, about 56, 57 AD. At this time, he was in Corinth. He was on his third missionary journey. And while he was in the city of Corinth, he's writing to Christians in Rome about how to handle themselves as Christians in Rome and what God has done for them. Right after he writes this, he's going to go back to Jerusalem, where he's going to get arrested. He's going to spend years in house arrest in Caesarea on the coast before being sent off to Rome, where he will face his ultimate end at the hands of Nero, where he loses his head. What's really interesting about this is that virtually every historian, every biblical scholar, whether Christian, skeptic, atheist, all agree Romans was written by Paul in the 50s. There's no scholarship that debates that questions that. This is one of the few New Testament books that everyone agrees on authorship, everyone agrees on time, which is great because what's in here is so powerful. Even if this were the only New Testament book we had, let's say other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there is enough in here to spread the word of Jesus, the truth of the gospel, to the world and for people to understand it. In fact, the theme of the book of Romans, in a sentence that we're going to be coming back to again and again and again, is this: salvation comes by faith. Salvation comes by faith. Now, this is transformative if you haven't heard that message before, or if you've heard that message, but then you live a different message where, okay, salvation's by faith, but I still have to do these religious things. In fact, Romans is one of those books that changed the world. I could probably count on one, maybe two hands, the books that have been written that have changed the world to the extent that Romans has changed the world. Whatever you think of Charles Darwin, Origin of Species, that book changed the world. You can't deny that book had a tremendous impact on how people think and how the world processes data and this wonderful thing called epistemology. Why do people think what they think? Well, they've been influenced by things like that book. Now, Romans is one of those books, and it goes back to the 1500s, the early part of the century, when there was a young monk in training named Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a good Roman Catholic. That was the prevailing view of Christianity in Europe at the time, and he was in training to be a monk. And while he was in his studies, he's reading the text of the New Testament. Now, that's not something everybody could do in those days because there wasn't a printing press yet. That was just coming along at roughly the same time. The Bible especially hadn't been translated into any of those languages people were speaking at the time. It was either in Latin or Greek, so you couldn't get it in German or English or Finnish or wherever you might be. So Luther's in the monastery and he's reading the New Testament, and he comes across Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, that is the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." And Martin Luther, this revolutionized him. He said in one of his letters, it was as if the curtains of heaven had opened up to me. This concept that salvation is by faith from beginning to end. See, Luther was a phenomenal monk in training at doing this stuff. One thing everybody agrees about Martin Luther is that he was an intense guy. He did not do things halfway. He was strong in his opinions. He was strong in his behavior. And what he would do before coming across Romans 1:16 and 17 is he would go to confession for hours at a time because he wanted so badly to be right with God. And he thought, because of what he had been trained, is that to be right with God, you have to fulfill the sacraments. You have to do the stuff. And so he would go to confession and he would confess everything. He would confess any thoughts he had, not just his behaviors, but his innermost thoughts and fears and darkness, and he'd be in there for hours. And finally, his confessor turned to him and said, "Marty, don't come back until you have something really bad. You're kind of wasting my time." And Luther said, "No, I got to figure this out. I got to figure out how to be right with God." So when he reads Romans 1 and it says to be right with God is based on your belief in what God has done for you, he said, the clouds parted, the curtains of heaven opened. And from that came the Protestant Reformation. From that came the Age of Enlightenment. From that came pretty much all of Western expansion, and colonialism was happening at all the same time, plus the printing press. Now the Bible's getting translated into different languages. This changed the world. These two verses that a guy in Germany came across changed the world. The book of Romans has altered human civilization. We aren't going to go through this lightly. We're going to go through this as thoroughly as possible, but I don't want to miss the point, and the point is this: salvation is by faith alone. We are saved not by works, but by faith. So we're going to get into some objections to that. Paul assumes people are going to have questions about that. He's going to talk about why do we need to be saved in the first place? How does this message of salvation by faith mix or contradict potentially things that came out of the Old Testament, like the law? He unpacks all of this to show that this has always been God's plan, and it is for all people. And so that is the best news there is. We're also going to get into who is the Holy Spirit and what part does he play in all this? Who is Jesus and his nature and what part does he play in all this? I hope to do these in, 10 to 15 minute pieces. Depends on how long the topic takes me, but I'll try to keep it so this is something you can listen to maybe while you're working out or cooking meals or whatever it is. And I'm going to try and have these up a couple times a week. This is going to be a profound study, but I'll do my best to make it fun so you can bust out the togas and your Caesar salads and we'll have a good time. Hopefully catch you next time in just a couple days as we start through with Romans 1, verse 1. Thanks.